So in this example, we're going to take a look at how to create different types of graphs using some sample data in Google Sheets. So this first graph I'm going to choose is a bar graph. And I have to look at my data and I realize that it's in different categories. And each of these categories has some sort of value associated with it. In this case, is a dollar value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my data, just the data that is going to be graphed. So can see here, I haven't selected the title of each column or the title of the table. Now, Google Sheets is smart enough to ignore that, but it's good practice just to select the data that you're using. If I go and hit Insert Chart, you can see Google Sheets defaults to what it thinks I want. This is a pretty good default bar graph. I don't have any huge complaints here. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to change the title. I like the title I've come up with. It's a little bit more descriptive. So I'm going to copy that information. And if I double click here, you can see that my customization options open up. So I can change the title text. I can delete that, put my title in there, and it populates it on top. There's tons of other customization options that are available here, and you should explore them on your own. Um, I can make this graph a little bit bigger, and as I change the way the graph is oriented, you can see that it will start to show more of the labels. So you want to make it as big as possible so you can see everything. You can change the way the labels are slanted if you don't like that. Most things you can keep to auto and you'll be just fine. For this particular bar graph, we don't need a legend or a series, so we can ignore these options. If you wanted to change this bottom category to something a little bit more meaningful, you could say something like household spending category, just to give it a little bit more meaning for our actual data set here. Average annual spending is fine. It's already in dollars, and we can see that label on the axis. If we didn't have the dollar amounts on the y-axis, we'd want to put the dollar amounts in the title. We can go ahead and close our customization options. So you can make this graph as big or as small as you want. You can stretch it vertically or horizontally. And then once you're done, you can download your graph as an image, or you can copy it and then paste it into a Google Sheet. The next graph we're going to look at is a line graph. So here is data that you want to see if it follows a certain trend. Each portion of the data is related somehow. So in this case, it's all weather, and you want to be able to see how the temperature goes up and then goes down over the course of a year. So in this case, we're going to use a line graph. So I'm going to select again just my data, ignoring the titles, insert chart, and in this case, it again defaulted to a bar graph or column graph. Now, this isn't a terrible graph for this particular example, but I do want to change it into a line graph. So one of the first things you're going to notice is that you have the opportunity to change the chart type. So we didn't use this the first time because it defaulted to the correct type. So here, if I click this arrow, I can see that I've got tons of different options, and it suggests to me the second suggestion is this line chart, which is great. So I'm going to select that, and it's automatically going to turn this into a line chart or a line graph for me. Again, I'm going to change this title up here. I don't like that one. I'm going to select mine instead. I double click here, and then I can go ahead and change the title to something more user friendly. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do with our line graph. One of the things is I would like to, if you wanted to change the line, so the dotted line or hash marks, you can do that as well. The one thing I would like to add are my points, because I do have 12 unique data points here, which are kind of lost in this graph. So if I go ahead and add my points to this graph, there I can see the actual values. You could add, if you wanted to, data labels to each point, and that gives the reader a little bit more information for what's going on here. The third type of graph I'm going to look at is a histogram. So a histogram is a little bit more complicated, but Google Sheets has the ability to uncomplicate it and do a lot of the automation for you. So here are a list of 15 random students and their term grades. Again, I'm going to start by selecting the data I want. I'm going to go insert chart. And here it's again defaulted to a column graph. This isn't terrible if I wanted to compare the 15 students independently. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to see the grade distribution. And I don't really care about which student got which grade. So I'm just kind of caring about the overall picture of the graph. So this is going to be called a histogram. And what a histogram is the data is grouped into different bins. and the number of points in each bin is what is graphed. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to scroll all the way down because the histogram is a specialty graph that's kind of hidden in the bottom. So it doesn't have a title, but it's this one right here. And if you hover over each different option, you'll see what it's called. So this one's a histogram chart. And this is what it gives us just as a default here. So I need to do a couple changes here. So first and foremost is the title is going to be distribution of student final grades as a percentage. On the y-axis, we typically put frequency. In the bottom here, we're going to change this. Obviously, it's not student number. It's going to be grade. So I can enter the title there. Great. Fantastic. Now, what we're going to also notice is that we might want to change these intervals. So these are weird intervals, 35, 48, 61, 74, 87, and 100. So I want to change that. So I can select some of the data here. And if I go to customize, under the histogram tab, which is different for this graph, we don't have that histogram tab in the other graphs. We can change the bucket size. So Google Sheets calls it a bucket. Microsoft Excel calls it a bin. So we can here change this to one of the default values. So maybe 5 or 10, or you can go ahead and put your own value in there. So I'm gonna leave it at 10 because I like that. It gives me all the data and it gives me a good distribution of what the data looks like. The last thing you need to know is that when you are dealing with these bins, the number on the left is included in that bin, and the number on the right is included in the subsequent bin. So this first bin right here starts at 35 and includes everything up to but not including 45. So 45 starts here, et cetera, et cetera. The exception, of course, is the last bin, which includes both 95 and 100. The last graph we're going to look at is a pie graph or a circle graph. Now, there is one drawback to doing circle graphs or pie graphs in Google Sheets, and we'll talk about that when we get there. The point of using a pie graph or a circle graph is when you are comparing parts of a whole. So in this case, we're comparing the number of valid votes for each political party in the 2019 Canadian federal election, and we are going to compare that as part of a whole. So we're looking at the total number of votes and then what the vote share was between each of the political parties. Now, this data is a little bit off because it doesn't include votes for ballots that were spoiled or didn't count. So it's just valid votes cast. So we're going to start again, as always, by selecting the data we're going to be using. Insert chart, and we're going to see probably a bar graph. That's fine. We're going to do the same thing as always, and we're going to flip this over to a pie chart, which is one of the suggested ones here. Again, I want to change this title. So I'm going to go ahead and select the title I've come up with, and I'm going to just double click and then throw my title in there. So that's great. There's not much else we really need to do. You can play around with the way the chart looks. You can add borders to each slices. We can pop out different parts of the graph. One thing that we don't need to do, which you may be tempted to do, is to add a label here. We can see that there's already labels done for us and they're in percentages, which is exactly what we want. Having the raw values isn't super useful for this case because we're just comparing the parts of a whole here. So what we don't need is we don't need to add this again because there's no point in showing the percentage here inside the pie and then again on the label. So we're just going to leave that off unless for some reason the way you've organized your chart or the way you've organized your legend, because we can move the legend down to the bottom, just as an example. And then, yeah, of course, you would want the different percentages inside your slices here. So we can see that we've come to an odd situation where some of the slices that are too small aren't showing us the percentages. So there's a couple ways that we can work around this. One of the easiest ways is going to be to select your slice that we want to talk about. So we go customize, pie slice, and then we'll choose, this is the People's Party slice, one that's very small here. So you would want to maybe pop it out a little bit. Maybe that's too much, so maybe 10%. And then afterwards, we can go ahead and kind of modify our graph a little bit by adding labels outside of this Google Sheet platform. So we've got 3 tiny bars here. You could insert a drawing if you wanted to. You could insert a text box and then add the percentage label that way instead of having to rely on the automated kind of Google Sheet graph software here. So this is just a problem when you have extremely small values, which is what happened in this last Canadian election. So the nice part is that if you hover over all of these, it will tell you the values that you need. So you could pop this out and insert a text box that just says 1.6%, 0.4%, 0.4%. Um, for the most part, if you have data that's nicely distributed, you won't have to do that. So we could have left the labels up where they were before. We can leave this in as percentages. If you copy this graph or download it as a PDF or a PNG, you will not have the ability to hover over those files. So this kind of data display only works because we're doing it in Google Sheets. Once you download this or copy this image somewhere else, you're going to see that that no longer works. The last thing we can do here is that because this data is taken from Canadian political parties and each political party has a specific color, it would be meaningful to us to change these colors. So I would change the Liberal Party of Canada to red. I would change the Conservative Party to blue. The Bloc Québécois is typically a light blue color. This is, I believe, is the NDP. They're orange. These are the Green parties. They're obviously green. I believe that the People's Party is typically like or has kind of this purple color to it, and then the last two are unaffiliated and independent, so those can be kind of your choice. So it's important to, if you can, match the colors what you're talking about. It just makes sense and it's easier for the reader. So that's all. Those are 4 different types of graphs that you may encounter, you may want to use, and they all have a very specific purpose. So remember the purpose of the graph when you're deciding which graph to make based on the data you've been given.